Colonel Marcus Hartwell had crushed dozens of careers during his 30-year military tenure, but he never imagined the quiet lieutenant he tormented would one day pin stars on her shoulders and become his commanding officer. This is the story of how Lieutenant Sarah Chen transformed from his favorite target into the general who would reshape his entire world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson as Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped off the military transport, her olive drab uniform crisp despite the long flight from the Pentagon. At 28, she possessed an understated presence that seemed almost fragile against the backdrop of Alaska's sprawling military installation. Her slight frame, barely meeting the minimum height requirements, carried itself with careful precision as she navigated through the maze of concrete buildings and administrative offices that would become her new professional battleground. Sarah's orders were straightforward: report to the 47th Intelligence Battalion as the new Operations Intelligence Officer, a position that would place her directly under the command of Colonel Marcus Hartwell. Her personnel file revealed an impressive academic record from West Point, advanced degrees in international relations and cybersecurity, and fluency in 4 languages including Mandarin and Arabic. What the file didn't capture was the quiet determination that had driven her to excel in every assignment, nor the personal cost of maintaining perfection in a military culture that often viewed Asian American women as perpetual outsiders. The battalion headquarters buzzed with the controlled chaos of a unit preparing for a major deployment. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency between briefing rooms and communication centers, their conversations punctuated by the constant hum of electronic equipment and the occasional sharp command from senior personnel. Sarah approached the main reception desk, her leather briefcase containing her orders and personal effects, representing the entirety of her professional identity in this new environment. "Lieutenant Chen reporting for duty," she announced to the staff sergeant behind the desk, her voice carrying the measured tone that had become second nature through years of military service. The sergeant, a weathered veteran with combat ribbons adorning his uniform, looked up from his paperwork with the practiced assessment of someone who had processed hundreds of new arrivals over the years. "Welcome to Alaska, Lieutenant," he replied, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "Colonel Hartwell is expecting you. Conference room 3, down the hall and to your right. He's in the middle of a briefing, but he said to send you in as soon as you arrived." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement and gathered her belongings, mentally preparing herself for the first encounter with her new commanding officer. The hallway stretched before her, lined with official photographs of previous battalion commanders and displays showcasing the unit's distinguished history in various conflicts. Each image seemed to tell a story of military tradition and masculine authority, a visual reminder of the institutional culture she was entering. The conference room door stood slightly ajar, revealing a gathering of senior officers clustered around a large table covered with maps, intelligence reports, and tactical displays. Colonel Marcus Hartwell commanded the room from the head of the table, his imposing presence immediately apparent even to someone observing from the doorway. At 6'3" with the build of a former football player, he possessed the kind of physical authority that dominated military environments through sheer presence alone. Hartwell's uniform was immaculate, adorned with ribbons and badges that spoke of multiple combat deployments and distinguished service. His graying hair was cut to regulation length, and his weathered face bore the confident expression of an officer who had never questioned his place in the military hierarchy. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravelly tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The intelligence picture in Sector 7 remains unclear," he was saying as Sarah approached the threshold. "We need better human intelligence assets in that region if we're going to provide accurate assessments to higher headquarters. The last thing we need is another intelligence failure that compromises operational security." Sarah knocked twice on the doorframe and stepped into the room, her posture at attention as she awaited acknowledgement. The conversation ceased as all eyes turned toward her, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. Colonel Hartwell's gaze swept over her with the calculating assessment of a predator evaluating potential. "Pray, Lieutenant Chen, I presume," he said, his tone carrying an undertone that suggested mild disappointment. "Come in and take a seat. We were just discussing the intelligence challenges facing our upcoming deployment." Sarah moved to the indicated chair, noting the subtle way the other officers seemed to distance themselves from her presence. Major Rodriguez, the battalion executive officer, offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, while Captain Williams, the intelligence analyst, maintained his focus on the documents before him. The dynamics in the room shifted perceptibly, as if her arrival had introduced an element of uncertainty into an otherwise comfortable masculine environment. "Your file indicates extensive academic credentials," Colonel Hartwell continued, his voice taking on a patronizing quality that made Sarah's shoulders tense involuntarily. "West Point, graduate degrees, language qualifications. Very impressive on paper. However, Lieutenant, this battalion operates in the real world, where theoretical knowledge means very little compared to practical experience and proven leadership under pressure." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah recognized the implicit message being delivered. Her academic achievements, rather than being viewed as assets, were being characterized as potential liabilities in an environment that valued combat experience and traditional military masculinity above intellectual capability. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her career, but the directness of Colonel Hartwell's assessment still struck her as unnecessarily harsh for a first meeting. "I understand, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. "I'm prepared to learn from experienced personnel and contribute to the battalion's mission in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." Colonel Hartwell's expression shifted slightly, revealing what might have been satisfaction at her deferential response. "That's exactly the attitude we need from our junior officers. This isn't the classroom, Lieutenant. Here we deal with real threats, real consequences, and real soldiers whose lives depend on accurate intelligence and decisive leadership. Academic theories won't stop bullets or prevent casualties when the shooting starts." The other officers in the room exchanged glances that suggested this type of welcome was not entirely unusual, though Sarah detected a hint of discomfort in Major Rodriguez's expression. Captain Williams continued to avoid eye contact, focusing intently on his paperwork as if trying to distance himself from the increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "Your predecessor, Lieutenant Morrison, was a solid officer," Colonel Hartwell continued, his tone becoming more conversational, but less pointed. "Infantry background, 2 combat tours, understood the realities of military operations. Unfortunately, he was reassigned to a staff position at division headquarters, which means we're starting over with someone who will need considerable time to reach his level of operational effectiveness." Sarah absorbed the comparison without visible reaction, though she understood the intended message. Lieutenant Morrison, presumably a white male officer with combat experience, represented the standard against which she would be measured. The implicit suggestion was that her lack of traditional military background made her an inadequate replacement for someone who better fit the battalion's cultural expectations. "I'm committed to meeting the standards expected of intelligence officers in this battalion," Sarah responded, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite the growing weight of the situation. "I believe my analytical skills and language capabilities can contribute to our mission success, and I'm prepared to work as hard as necessary to prove my value to the unit." Colonel Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting mild amusement at her earnest response. "Commitment is admirable, Lieutenant, but this battalion has a reputation for excellence that was built by officers who understood the difference between academic achievement and military competence. We'll see whether your particular skill set translates into the kind of performance we require. The briefing resumed with discussions of deployment schedules, intelligence requirements, and logistical considerations. Sarah found herself largely excluded from the conversation, occasionally receiving cursory explanations of procedures and systems that the other officers seemed to assume she wouldn't understand. When she attempted to ask clarifying questions about intelligence collection priorities, Colonel Hartwell's responses were brief and dismissive, suggesting that such matters were beyond her current level of understanding. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Major Rodriguez, who had remained largely silent during the initial exchange, eventually leaned over to provide Sarah with a copy of the deployment timeline and her specific duty assignments. His gesture was professional, but carried an undertone of sympathy that suggested he recognized the difficulty of her situation. Captain Williams, meanwhile, continued to avoid direct interaction, though Sarah noticed him glancing in her direction with what might have been curiosity or concern. The briefing concluded with Colonel Hartwell assigning specific tasks to each officer. Sarah received responsibility for managing routine intelligence reports and maintaining liaison with external agencies, duties that were clearly junior-level assignments, despite her qualifications for more complex analytical work. The colonel's instructions were delivered with the same patronizing tone that had characterized their entire interaction. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to familiarize yourself with our standard operating procedures before attempting any independent analysis," he said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Previous officers have made the mistake of trying to implement changes before understanding how this battalion actually operates. We've developed our methods through years of successful missions, and we don't need theoretical innovations that haven't been tested in real-world conditions. Sarah nodded her understanding, though she couldn't help but notice that her extensive intelligence training and analytical experience were being dismissed as mere theoretical knowledge. The message was clear. Her value to the battalion would be determined not by her capabilities, but by her willingness to conform to existing procedures and accept her place in the established hierarchy. As the meeting dispersed and the other officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Hartwell for the first time. He remained seated at the head of the table, reviewing documents with the deliberate pace of someone who was in no hurry to conclude their interaction. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken expectations and implicit challenges. "Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice taking on a more informal tone that somehow felt more threatening than his previous professional demeanor. "I want to be clear about something. This battalion has a culture of excellence that has been built over decades of successful operations. We don't have time for officers who need extensive handholding or who can't adapt quickly to our operational tempo." Sarah remained at attention, sensing that this was a defining moment in their relationship. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to meet whatever standards you set for intelligence officers in this unit." Colonel Hartwell's expression hardened slightly, as if her response had somehow disappointed him. "The standards I set aren't arbitrary, Lieutenant. They're based on the proven performance of officers who have demonstrated their worth under combat conditions. Your file shows impressive academic credentials, but it doesn't show the kind of leadership experience that builds confidence in subordinates and peers." The criticism stung because it contained enough truth to be difficult to dismiss entirely. Sarah's rapid promotion through the ranks had been based largely on her intellectual capabilities and analytical skills, with limited opportunities for traditional leadership roles in combat units. Colonel Hartwell had identified what he perceived as a weakness and was using it to establish the parameters of their professional relationship. "I'm hoping to gain that experience here, sir," Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "I believe my analytical skills can contribute to the battalion's mission, while I develop the leadership experience you're referring to." Colonel Hartwell stood from his chair, his physical presence emphasizing the power dynamic. Between them, hope is not a strategy, Lieutenant. This battalion operates on proven capabilities and demonstrated performance. You'll have opportunities to prove yourself, but I want you to understand that the standard here is excellence, not potential. Sarah left the conference room with a clear understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. Colonel Hartwell had established himself as a formidable opponent who viewed her presence as a potential threat to his battalion's established culture. His assessment of her capabilities was harsh, but not entirely unfair, and she recognized that proving herself would require more than just technical competence. The administrative processing that followed her initial meeting consumed the remainder of the day. Sarah received her quarters assignment, security clearances, and orientation briefings that covered everything from base facilities to emergency procedures. Each interaction with battalion personnel revealed subtle signs of the institutional culture she was entering, from the casual conversations that ceased when she approached to the polite but distant professionalism that characterized her reception. Her quarters in the officers' housing complex were Spartan but adequate, furnished with military-issued furniture and basic amenities. The small apartment felt isolated despite being surrounded by similar units housing her fellow officers, emphasizing her status as an outsider in a close-knit military community. Sarah unpacked her belongings with methodical efficiency, transforming the anonymous space into something that resembled home, through the careful arrangement of personal photographs and professional references. That evening, she sat at her desk reviewing the battalion's organizational structure and mission requirements, preparing herself for the challenges that would begin the following morning. The intelligence requirements were complex and demanding, requiring the kind of analytical sophistication that had been her specialty throughout her career. However, she understood that technical competence would not be sufficient to succeed in an environment where Colonel Hartwell had already established his expectations for her performance. The sound of laughter drifted through her window from the officers' club, where her new colleagues were presumably sharing drinks and war stories in the informal social environment that built unit cohesion. Sarah had not been invited to join them, though she wasn't certain whether the exclusion was intentional or simply an oversight in the chaos of her first day. Either way, the message was clear. Acceptance into the battalion's social fabric would require more than just reporting for duty. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. Colonel Hartwell had made his position clear through both direct statements and subtle implications. He viewed her as an unproven outsider whose presence represented a potential disruption to his battalion's established culture and operational effectiveness. The other officers had followed his lead, maintaining professional courtesy while clearly withholding the kind of acceptance that would make her an integral part of the team. Sarah understood that the coming weeks would test not only her technical capabilities, but also her resilience in the face of systematic exclusion and professional isolation. Colonel Hartwell had established the parameters of their relationship, and she would need to navigate carefully between proving her worth and avoiding the kind of confrontation that could damage her career prospects. The quiet determination that had sustained her through previous challenges would be essential in the battles ahead. The Alaska night settled over Fort Richardson with the particular stillness that characterized military installations after duty hours. Sarah Chen lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and processing the events of her first day under Colonel Hartwell's command. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself, but tonight she allowed herself to acknowledge the difficulty of the situation she had entered. In the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of military life continuing its 24-hour cycle, the rumble of vehicles on patrol, the measured footsteps of guards making their rounds, and the occasional radio communication that connected Fort Richardson to the broader network of military installations around the world. These sounds, familiar from previous assignments, provided a measure of comfort in an environment that had made clear her status as an unwelcome outsider. Colonel Hartwell's words echoed in her mind as she drifted toward sleep, a reminder of the standards she would need to meet and the skepticism she would need to overcome. The road ahead would be difficult, but Sarah Chen had never been one to retreat from challenges. Tomorrow would begin the process of proving that quiet competence could triumph over institutional prejudice, though she had no way of knowing that. Her journey would eventually lead to a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined her. First day in the 47th Intelligence Battalion. The morning reveille at Fort Richardson echoed across the compound at precisely 0630 hours. But Sarah Chen had already been awake for 90 minutes, reviewing intelligence briefings and preparing for her first full day under Colonel Hartwell's command. She had learned early in her military career that being prepared was her best defense against those who questioned her presence, and today would test that philosophy more thoroughly than any previous assignment. The battalion operations center buzzed with the controlled intensity of a military unit, transitioning from night operations to day shift activities. Banks of computer monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds from across the Pacific Theater, while communications specialists maintained contact with field units and higher headquarters. Sarah entered the facility at 0700 hours 30 minutes, before her required reporting time, hoping to demonstrate her commitment to the mission and perhaps begin building relationships with her fellow officers. Captain Williams glanced up from his workstation as she approached, his expression neutral, but not unfriendly. "Morning, Lieutenant. Early start today?" "I wanted to review the overnight intelligence summaries before the morning briefing," Sarah replied, settling into the workstation that had been designated as hers. The computer terminal was older than the others in the facility, and she noticed that her access permissions were limited to basic intelligence databases rather than the more sophisticated analytical tools available to other officers. "Colonel Hartwell likes his briefings comprehensive but concise," Williams offered, returning his attention to his own work. "Focus on actionable intelligence and avoid theoretical analysis. He's not interested in academic exercises." The warning was delivered casually, but Sarah recognized its significance. Captain Williams was providing guidance that could help her avoid the kind of mistakes that might further damage her standing with Colonel Hartwell. She appreciated the gesture, though she couldn't help but wonder whether similar warnings had been necessary for her predecessor. Major Rodriguez arrived at 0715 hours, carrying a stack of classified documents and wearing the focused expression of an officer preparing for a demanding day. As the battalion executive officer, he served as the primary intermediary between Colonel Hartwell and the junior officers, a position that required diplomatic skills and political awareness. His greeting to Sarah was professionally cordial, but brief, suggesting that he was maintaining careful neutrality in the developing dynamics between her and the colonel. "Lieutenant Chen," Rodriguez said, settling into his workstation, "I need you to prepare summaries of the overnight intelligence reports from sectors 4 through 7. Keep them to 1 page each, focus on threats and anomalies, and have them ready for the 0800 briefing." Sarah nodded and began accessing the required reports, quickly discovering that her limited system permissions made the task more complicated than it should have been. Several of the databases she needed were restricted, forcing her to request access through Captain Williams, who seemed surprised by the limitations placed on her account. "That's unusual," Williams muttered, entering his own credentials to provide her with the necessary access. "Intelligence officers typically have broader permissions than this. I'll check with the IT section after the briefing." The morning briefing convened in the main conference room at precisely 0800 hours, with Colonel Hartwell presiding over a gathering of the battalion's key personnel. Sarah had prepared her intelligence summaries with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that each report contained the actionable information that Williams had suggested was important. She had also prepared backup slides with more detailed analysis in case the colonel requested additional information. Colonel Hartwell entered the room with the commanding presence that had intimidated junior officers throughout his career. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident, and his expression suggested that he was prepared to identify and address any deficiencies in his subordinates' performance. Sarah felt the familiar tension that accompanied her interactions with him, though she was determined to prove her competence through professional excellence. "Let's begin with the intelligence summary," Colonel Hartwell announced, his gaze settling on Sarah with unmistakable expectation. "Lieutenant Chen, walk us through the overnight developments." Sarah approached the podium with her prepared materials, her voice steady despite the weight of scrutiny from the assembled officers. She began with the intelligence summary for Sector 4, providing a concise overview of surveillance activities and potential threats. Her presentation was professional and thorough, incorporating the kind of analytical insights that had distinguished her performance in previous assignments. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," Colonel Hartwell interrupted after she had been speaking for less than 2 minutes. "I asked for actionable intelligence, not a graduate school lecture. What specifically do field commanders need to know about threats in Sector 4? The interruption was delivered with the kind of public criticism that was designed to establish dominance rather than provide constructive feedback. Sarah felt the eyes of every officer in the room focusing on her response, recognizing this as a defining moment in her relationship with the battalion's leadership. "Sir, the primary actionable intelligence is increased electronic surveillance activity near the coastal monitoring stations, suggesting potential reconnaissance operations by hostile forces," she replied, her voice remaining professional despite the embarrassment of being corrected in front of her peers. "That's better," Colonel Hartwell said, his tone suggesting mild approval mixed with continued skepticism. "Remember, Lieutenant, we're not writing academic papers here. We're providing information that keeps soldiers alive and missions successful. Continue with the other sectors and keep it focused." Sarah proceeded through her remaining briefing materials, adjusting her presentation style to match Colonel Hartwell's preferences for brevity and specificity. However, she noticed that her corrections seemed to have established a pattern for the remainder of the briefing. Every comment she made was subjected to additional scrutiny, and her analytical insights were consistently characterized as excessive or irrelevant. When Captain Williams presented his intelligence assessment for Sectors 8 through 10, his presentation style was remarkably similar to Sarah's original approach, complete with detailed analysis and theoretical frameworks. However, Colonel Hartwell listened without interruption and actually complimented Williams on his thoroughness. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and Sarah realized that she was being held to different standards than her male colleagues. Major Rodriguez presented the operational update with the kind of comprehensive detail that would have drawn criticism if delivered by Sarah. His briefing included historical context, analytical speculation, and theoretical frameworks that went well beyond the actionable intelligence standard that had been established for her presentation. Colonel Hartwell not only tolerated this approach but engaged with Rodriguez in a detailed discussion of strategic implications. "Excellent analysis, Major," Colonel Hartwell said as Rodriguez concluded his presentation. "This is exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking we need from our senior officers. The ability to see the bigger picture and understand the strategic implications of tactical developments is what separates competent officers from exceptional ones." Sarah absorbed the lesson with growing understanding of the institutional dynamics she was facing. The standards applied to her performance were not universal, but specific to her position as an outsider in the battalion's established culture. Colonel Hartwell was using his authority to establish her inferior status through the application of arbitrary and inconsistent expectations. Following the briefing, the officers dispersed to their various duties, but Sarah noticed that several of them lingered to engage in informal conversations with Colonel Hartwell. These casual interactions, characterized by shared jokes and personal references, highlighted the social bonds that existed within the battalion's leadership structure. Sarah was not invited to participate in these conversations, nor did she feel comfortable attempting to join them uninvited. Captain Williams approached her as she was gathering her briefing materials, his expression suggesting concern about the dynamics he had observed. "Don't take the colonel's feedback personally," he said quietly. "He's tough on all new officers until they prove themselves." "I understand," Sarah replied, though she wondered whether Williams truly believed his own assessment or was simply trying to provide encouragement. The differential treatment she had observed during the briefing suggested that Colonel Hartwell's approach to new officers was not uniformly applied. The remainder of the morning was spent on routine intelligence tasks that seemed designed to keep Sarah occupied rather than utilize her analytical capabilities. She was assigned to update filing systems, review administrative procedures, and conduct equipment inventories that had little connection to the battalion's operational mission. Meanwhile, Captain Williams and the other intelligence officers worked on complex analytical projects that would have been well suited to her background and expertise. Rodriguez stopped by her workstation around mid-morning, ostensibly to check on her progress with the administrative tasks. However, Sarah sensed that he was also evaluating her reaction to the morning's events and her overall adaptation to the battalion's culture. "How are you settling in, Lieutenant?" he asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest in her welfare. "Fine, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served her throughout her career. "I'm working to understand the battalion's procedures and contribute to the mission in whatever way Colonel Hartwell deems appropriate." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested that he recognized the diplomatic nature of her response. "The colonel has high standards for all his officers," he said carefully. "Sometimes it takes time to understand exactly what he's looking for in terms of performance and approach." Sarah understood that Rodriguez was attempting to provide guidance without directly criticizing his commanding officer. The implication was that Colonel Hartwell's treatment of her was part of a broader pattern of demanding leadership rather than specific hostility toward her personally. However, her observations of the morning briefing suggested otherwise. The lunch hour brought a brief respite from the tensions of the morning, though Sarah found herself eating alone in the officers' dining facility while her colleagues gathered at tables where their conversations were punctuated by laughter and camaraderie. She had not been explicitly excluded from these social gatherings, but neither had she been invited to join them. The result was a form of isolation that was perhaps more damaging than outright hostility. Captain Williams approached her table. As she was finishing her meal, carrying his own tray and wearing an expression that suggested he was making a deliberate effort to be inclusive. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for a response. "Of course," Sarah replied, grateful for the company despite her uncertainty about Williams' motivations. "I've been thinking about the system access issues you had this morning," Williams said, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by nearby tables. "IT claims that your account was set up according to standard protocols, but I've never seen intelligence officers with such limited permissions. I'm going to follow up with them this afternoon." Sarah appreciated his attention to the technical problem, though she suspected that the limitations placed on her system access were not the result of administrative oversight. "Thank you. I'll need broader access to complete the analytical tasks that are part of my job description." Williams nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "Look, I don't want to overstep, but I've been in this battalion for 2 years, and I've seen how new officers are integrated into the unit. The process isn't always smooth, but it's usually more collaborative than what you experienced this morning." The comment was carefully phrased to avoid direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell, but Sarah understood the message. Williams had observed the differential treatment she was receiving and was subtly acknowledging that her concerns about unfair standards were valid. His willingness to address the issue, even indirectly, suggested that he might become an ally. In the challenges ahead. "I appreciate your perspective," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "I'm committed to meeting whatever standards are expected of intelligence officers in this battalion, and I'm grateful for any guidance you can provide." The afternoon brought a series of meetings and briefings that further illustrated the complex dynamics within the battalion's leadership structure. Sarah was included in these sessions, but consistently assigned to passive roles that minimized her opportunities to demonstrate her analytical capabilities. When she did contribute to discussions, her comments were often dismissed or redirected in ways that suggested they were not valued by the senior leadership. During a planning meeting for the upcoming deployment, Colonel Hartwell outlined the intelligence requirements for the mission with the kind of detail that would have benefited from Sarah's expertise in regional analysis and cultural intelligence. However, when she attempted to provide input based on her academic background and language skills, the colonel's response was dismissive. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but these requirements have been developed through extensive consultation with regional experts and experienced intelligence officers," he said, his tone suggesting that her input was presumptuous. "Your role will be to support the implementation of these requirements, not to question their validity." The rebuke was delivered in front of the entire planning team, creating another moment of public embarrassment that seemed designed to establish Sarah's subordinate status. Major Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Captain Williams focused intently on his notes to avoid making eye contact with anyone in the room. Sarah absorbed the criticism without visible reaction, though she recognized that Colonel Hartwell was systematically undermining her credibility with the other officers. Each public correction reinforced the impression that she was not qualified for her position and that her attempts to contribute were inappropriate or misguided. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon, with Colonel Hartwell consistently applying different standards to Sarah's performance than to her male colleagues. When she asked clarifying questions about procedures, she was told that such details were beyond her current level of understanding. When she offered analytical insights, she was criticized for exceeding her authority or providing unnecessary complexity. By late afternoon, Sarah had begun to understand that she was facing a systematic campaign of professional marginalization, rather than the normal challenges of adapting to a new unit. Colonel Hartwell's approach was sophisticated and deniable, using his legitimate authority as a commanding officer to create conditions that would make her position untenable while avoiding the kind of overt discrimination that might attract official attention. The daily intelligence briefing at 1700 hours provided another opportunity for Colonel Hartwell to demonstrate his approach to Sarah's integration into the battalion. She had prepared a comprehensive analysis of emerging threats based on her review of classified intelligence reports, incorporating the kind of sophisticated analytical framework that had been her specialty throughout her career. "Lieutenant Chen, your intelligence summary for today," Colonel Hartwell announced, his tone neutral, but carrying an undertone of expectation that suggested he was prepared to find fault with her performance. Sarah began her presentation with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout her career, providing a detailed analysis of intelligence developments and their implications for the battalion's mission. Her presentation was thorough, well-organized, and incorporated the kind of insights that would have been valued in her previous assignments. "Stop right there, Lieutenant," Colonel Hartwell interrupted after she had been speaking for less than 3 minutes. "This is exactly the kind of academic theorizing that has no place in operational intelligence. You're providing analysis that our field commanders neither need nor want." The interruption was more abrupt than his previous corrections, and Sarah sensed that Colonel Hartwell was escalating his campaign of public criticism. The other officers in the room appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the dynamic, but none seemed willing to challenge their commanding officer's approach. Sir, I was attempting to provide the kind of analytical context that might help commanders understand the broader implications of these intelligence developments, Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady despite the growing hostility of the situation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. What commanders need, Lieutenant, is actionable intelligence that helps them make tactical decisions, Colonel Hartwell responded, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his patience was being tested. They don't need graduate school dissertations on geopolitical theory. If you can't provide practical intelligence support, then perhaps you're not suited for this position. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Colonel Hartwell was suggesting that Sarah's continued employment in the battalion was contingent on her ability to conform to his expectations, regardless of whether those expectations were reasonable or consistent with her job description. The message was clear: adapt to his standards or face the consequences. Sarah concluded her briefing with the abbreviated format that Colonel Hartwell preferred, though she knew that the intelligence she was providing was less comprehensive and useful than what her training and experience could have produced. The compromise felt like a betrayal of her professional standards, but she understood that her position in the battalion was precarious enough that direct confrontation would be counterproductive. As the officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah remained behind to organize her materials and process the events of the day. The systematic nature of Colonel Hartwell's approach was becoming increasingly clear, and she realized that she was facing a challenge that would require more than just professional competence to overcome. Major Rodriguez approached her as she was gathering her papers, his expression suggesting concern about the direction of her relationship with Colonel Hartwell. "Lieutenant, do you have a moment?" "Of course, sir," Sarah replied, recognizing that Rodriguez might be attempting to provide guidance or perspective on the day's events. "I want you to know that your analytical skills are valued in this battalion," Rodriguez said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid being overheard. "Sometimes it takes time to understand exactly how to present information in the format that works best for our operational environment." Sarah understood that Rodriguez was attempting to provide encouragement, while avoiding direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell's approach. His comment suggested that he recognized the quality of her work even if the colonel did not, though she wondered whether his support would translate into any practical assistance. "I appreciate that feedback, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm committed to adapting my approach to meet the battalion's requirements." Rodriguez nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "The colonel has a particular way of developing his officers. It's not always comfortable, but it's usually effective. Give it time, and focus on proving yourself through consistent performance." Sarah left the conference room with a clear understanding that her first day as a fully integrated member of the battalion had established the parameters of her relationship with Colonel Hartwell. He had systematically undermined her credibility, applied inconsistent standards to her performance, and created conditions that would make her success dependent on his approval rather than her professional competence. The evening hours brought no relief from the tensions of the day. Sarah returned to her quarters to find that her request for additional system access had been denied, limiting her ability to perform the analytical tasks that were central to her job description. The administrative obstacles seemed designed to prevent her from demonstrating her capabilities rather than support her integration into the battalion's operations. As she prepared for another day under Colonel Hartwell's command, Sarah reflected on the challenges she was facing and the strategies she would need to employ to survive in this hostile environment. The colonel had made clear that he viewed her presence as a disruption to his battalion's culture, and he was using his authority to create conditions that would either force her to conform to his expectations or provide justification for her removal. The quiet determination that had sustained Sarah throughout her career would be tested in the weeks ahead. as she navigated the complex dynamics of military hierarchy and institutional prejudice. Colonel Hartwell had established himself as a formidable opponent, but Sarah had not yet begun to demonstrate the full extent of her capabilities or the depth of her commitment to proving herself worthy of the position she had earned through years of dedicated service. The third week of Sarah's assignment brought the battalion's first major operational exercise, a comprehensive simulation designed to test the unit's readiness for their upcoming deployment to the Korean Peninsula. Operation Northern Shield would evaluate everything from intelligence gathering and analysis to tactical decision-making and inter-unit coordination. For Sarah, it represented the first opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities in a high-stakes environment where her performance would be scrutinized by not only Colonel Hartwell but also by visiting evaluators from Pacific Command. The exercise began at 0400 hours on a Monday morning, with the Battalion Operations Center transforming into a realistic command post environment. Banks of monitors displayed simulated intelligence feeds from across the fictional combat zone, while communication specialists maintained contact with role-playing enemy forces and friendly units. Sarah had spent the previous weekend studying the exercise scenario, identifying potential intelligence gaps and preparing analytical frameworks that could support rapid decision-making under pressure. Colonel Hartwell arrived at the operations center 30 minutes before the exercise commencement, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every officer and enlisted soldier in the facility. He moved through the various workstations with the practiced eye of a commander who understood that exercises often revealed more about unit capabilities than months of routine operations. When he reached Sarah's position, his expression suggested skeptical curiosity about how she would perform under the pressure of real-time intelligence analysis. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone that had characterized their interaction since her arrival. "Your primary responsibility during this exercise will be to provide intelligence support to the operations staff. I want timely, accurate, and actionable intelligence that supports tactical decision-making. This is not an academic exercise, and I expect your analysis to reflect operational realities rather than theoretical possibilities." Sarah nodded her understanding, though she recognized that Colonel Hartwell was once again establishing different standards for her performance. And for her colleagues, Captain Williams, who was responsible for strategic intelligence analysis, had not received similar warnings about avoiding academic approaches. Major Rodriguez, who would be coordinating with higher headquarters, had been encouraged to provide comprehensive analytical context. The message was clear: Sarah's contributions would be evaluated more harshly than those of her peers. The exercise scenario unfolded with the kind of complexity that tested every aspect of military intelligence operations. Enemy forces were conducting sophisticated deception operations, friendly units were reporting conflicting information, and higher headquarters was demanding immediate answers to questions that required careful analysis to resolve accurately. Sarah found herself at the center of this informational chaos, tasked with making sense of contradictory reports and providing recommendations that could influence major tactical decisions. Her first challenge came within 2 hours of the exercise commencement, when reconnaissance units reported unusual activity near a critical transportation hub. The initial reports suggested enemy troop movements, but Sarah's analysis of the available intelligence indicated that the activity was more likely a deception operation designed to draw friendly forces away from the actual axis of attack. Her assessment was based on pattern analysis techniques she had developed during her graduate studies, combined with her understanding of enemy tactical doctrine. "Colonel," Sarah announced, approaching the command post with her analysis, "I believe the enemy activity near Checkpoint 7 is a deception operation rather than a genuine troop movement. The pattern of communications intercepts and the timing of the reported movements suggest they're trying to draw our attention away from their actual objective. Colonel Hartwell examined her analysis with the kind of intense scrutiny that had become familiar to Sarah over the past 3 weeks. His expression suggested skepticism about her conclusions, though she couldn't determine whether his doubt was based on the substance of her analysis or his general distrust of her capabilities. "That's an interesting theory, Lieutenant," he said, his tone suggesting that he viewed her assessment as speculative rather than analytical. "However, we can't ignore confirmed enemy activity based on theoretical assumptions about their intentions. I want you to continue monitoring the situation and provide updates as new information becomes available." Sarah understood that Colonel Hartwell was dismissing her analysis without serious consideration, though she was confident that her assessment was correct. The enemy deception operation was sophisticated, but followed predictable patterns that her analytical training had taught her to recognize. However, she also understood that challenging the colonel's decision would be counterproductive, particularly in front of the other officers who were observing their interaction. "Yes, sir," she replied, returning to her workstation to continue monitoring the developing situation. She maintained her analytical focus on the areas where she believed the actual enemy attack would occur, while also tracking the deception operation that was capturing the attention of the command staff. Captain Williams approached her position. An hour later, his expression suggesting concern about the intelligence picture that was developing. "What's your assessment of the situation in Sector 12? He asked, referring to the area where Sarah had predicted the actual enemy attack would occur. "I'm seeing increased electronic activity and movement patterns that suggest preparation for offensive operations," Sarah replied, her voice low enough to avoid being overheard by Colonel Hartwell. "The signatures are subtle, but they're consistent with pre-attack reconnaissance and positioning." Williams studied her analysis with the kind of professional interest that had been absent from Colonel Hartwell's response. "This is solid work," he said after reviewing her data. "Have you briefed the colonel on these developments?" "He's focused on the situation near Checkpoint 7, Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm continuing to monitor both areas and will provide updates as the situation develops." Williams nodded, though his expression suggested that he understood the political dynamics that were preventing Sarah's analysis from receiving appropriate consideration. The intelligence she was developing was exactly the kind of actionable information that should have been driving tactical decisions, but her recommendations were being marginalized because of Colonel Hartwell's predetermined assessment of her capabilities. The exercise continued to unfold with increasing complexity as enemy forces executed their planned operations. Sarah watched with growing concern as friendly units were repositioned to counter the deception operation near Checkpoint 7, leaving other areas vulnerable to the actual attack that she had predicted. Her analysis proved increasingly accurate as the morning progressed, but the command staff remained focused on the more obvious enemy activity that was drawing their attention. Major Rodriguez appeared at her workstation around mid-morning, carrying a stack of intelligence reports and wearing the focused expression of an officer dealing with rapidly developing situations. "Lieutenant, I need your assessment of enemy capabilities in Sectors 10 through 15, he said, his tone suggesting that he was seeking her professional judgment rather than merely assigning routine tasks. Sarah provided a comprehensive briefing on enemy force dispositions and capabilities, incorporating the analytical insights that had been dismissed by Colonel Hartwell. Rodriguez listened with obvious interest, asking detailed questions that demonstrated his understanding of the intelligence picture and his respect for her analytical capabilities. "This is excellent work," Rodriguez said after reviewing her analysis. "Your assessment of enemy deception operations is particularly insightful. Have you discussed these findings with the colonel?" "I've provided him with updates on the developing situation," Sarah replied, maintaining diplomatic neutrality while acknowledging the reality of her marginalized position in the command structure. Rodriguez's expression suggested that he understood the subtext of her response. I think the Colonel would benefit from hearing your comprehensive analysis of the enemy situation, he said carefully. Sometimes it's useful to have multiple perspectives on complex intelligence problems. Sarah recognized that Rodriguez was providing her with an opportunity to present her analysis directly to Colonel Hartwell, though she also understood that the Major was taking a risk by advocating for her input. The battalion's command dynamics were sufficiently clear that any officer who supported her too openly might face consequences from the Colonel. The opportunity to present her analysis came during the midday intelligence briefing, when Colonel Hartwell requested updates on all sectors of the operational area. Sarah had prepared a comprehensive assessment that demonstrated the accuracy of her earlier predictions while providing actionable recommendations for countering the actual enemy threat. "Colonel," she began, her voice carrying the professional confidence that had characterized her performance throughout her career, "I believe the enemy is executing a sophisticated deception operation designed to mask their actual attack objectives. The activity near Checkpoint 7 appears to be a deliberate attempt to draw our attention away from their primary axis of advance." Colonel Hartwell's expression hardened as she spoke, suggesting that he viewed her persistent analysis as insubordination rather than professional duty. "Lieutenant, we've already discussed this theory of yours. I need current intelligence on confirmed enemy activities, not speculation about what they might be doing." "Sir, the intelligence indicators are becoming increasingly clear," Sarah continued. Recognizing that this might be her only opportunity to present her analysis before the exercise situation deteriorated further. Enemy communications patterns, movement signatures, and timing all indicate preparation for offensive operations in sectors 12 through 14. The tension in the command post was palpable as Colonel Hartwell considered her assessment. Sarah could feel the attention of every officer in the facility focused on their exchange, understanding that this moment would define not only her credibility, but also her future in the battalion. The Colonel's response would establish whether her professional judgment would be taken seriously or dismissed as the presumptuous theorizing of an inexperienced officer. "Your analysis is noted, Lieutenant," Colonel Hartwell said finally, his tone suggesting that he was ending the discussion rather than accepting her recommendations. "Continue monitoring the situation and provide updates as new information becomes available." Sarah returned to her workstation with the understanding that her analysis had been officially acknowledged but practically ignored. The command staff continued to focus on the deception operation that was consuming their attention and resources, while the actual enemy threat developed in the sectors she had identified as vulnerable. The afternoon brought validation of Sarah's analytical assessment in the most dramatic way possible. Enemy forces launched their primary attack through sectors 12 and 13, achieving tactical surprise against friendly units that had been repositioned to counter the deception operation. The exercise evaluators noted the success of the enemy deception and the failure of friendly forces to anticipate the actual axis of attack. Colonel Hartwell's response to the developing crisis was swift and professional, though Sarah noticed that he avoided making eye contact with her as he issued orders to counter the enemy breakthrough. The command staff worked frantically to reposition forces and establish new defensive lines, while the exercise evaluators observed the consequences of the intelligence failure that Sarah had attempted to prevent. Captain Williams approached her position as the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. "Your analysis was right," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and frustration. "You called this exactly. Intelligence analysis is only valuable if it influences decision-making," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional focus despite the vindication of her assessment. "I should have found a more effective way to communicate the urgency of the threat." Williams shook his head. "You did everything right. The problem wasn't with your analysis or your presentation. The problem was that nobody was willing to listen." The exercise concluded that evening with a comprehensive after-action review that examined every aspect of the battalion's performance. Sarah sat in the back of the conference room as senior officers discussed the lessons learned from the simulation, including the intelligence failure that had allowed enemy forces to achieve tactical surprise. The evaluators from Pacific Command were particularly critical of the command staff's response to intelligence indicators that had clearly suggested the actual enemy objectives. The intelligence was available to prevent this tactical surprise, announced Colonel Morrison, the senior evaluator from Pacific Command. Analysis conducted by your intelligence staff correctly identified the enemy deception operation and predicted their actual attack objectives. However, this analysis was not effectively integrated into the decision-making process. Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room as Colonel Morrison continued his assessment. The evaluator was clearly referring to her analysis, though he was diplomatically avoiding direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell's leadership decisions. The implication was clear: the battalion's intelligence failure was the result of command dysfunction rather than analytical incompetence. Colonel Hartwell's response was measured but defensive. The intelligence picture was complex and contradictory, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a commander who was not accustomed to having his decisions questioned. We made tactical decisions based on the most reliable information available at the time. With respect, Colonel, Morrison replied, the intelligence was neither complex nor contradictory. Lieutenant Chun's analysis was consistently accurate throughout the exercise, and her predictions proved correct in every significant respect. The failure was not in intelligence gathering or analysis, but in the utilization of available intelligence to support decision-making. The public vindication of Sarah's performance was more complete than she had dared to hope, though she understood that it would likely increase rather than decrease the tension between her and Colonel Hartwell. The colonel's authority had been questioned in front of his subordinates and visiting evaluators, creating a situation that would require careful navigation in the days ahead. As the after-action review concluded, and officers began filing out of the conference room, Sarah found herself approached by several of her colleagues who had observed her performance during the exercise. Their comments were uniformly positive, acknowledging the accuracy of her analysis and the professional competence she had demonstrated under pressure. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant," said Captain Martinez from the operations staff. "Your analysis was exactly what we needed to counter the enemy deception. I hope we'll have better integration of intelligence and operations in future exercises." Similar comments came from other officers who had witnessed her performance, creating a stark contrast between the recognition she was receiving from her peers and the hostility she continued to face from Colonel Hartwell. The dichotomy was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and Sarah understood that the colonel's isolation of her was becoming more apparent to the other officers in the battalion. Major Rodriguez appeared at her side as she was organizing her materials from the exercise. "Walk with me, Lieutenant," he said, his tone suggesting that he wanted to discuss the day's events away from the other officers. They walked in silence through the corridors of the battalion headquarters until they reached Rodriguez's office, where he closed the door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. His expression was serious but not unfriendly, suggesting that he was preparing to address the obvious tension between her and Colonel Hartwell. "Your performance during the exercise was exceptional," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying genuine admiration for her analytical capabilities. "The evaluators were impressed, and your colleagues have taken notice of your professional competence. That's significant recognition for an officer who has been with the battalion for only 3 weeks. Sarah appreciated the feedback, though. She sensed that Rodriguez was building toward a more complex discussion of her situation. "Thank you, sir. I'm committed to providing the best possible intelligence support to the battalion's mission." Rodriguez nodded, then leaned forward in his chair with the expression of someone who was about to address a difficult topic. "I think you understand that your relationship with Colonel Hartwell is complicated. Today's exercise has highlighted some of those complications in ways that will require careful management. The diplomatic language couldn't obscure the reality that Rodriguez was acknowledging. Colonel Hartwell's treatment of Sarah was becoming a problem that affected the battalion's operational effectiveness. The major was providing guidance that could help her navigate the political dynamics while continuing to perform her professional duties. "I appreciate your perspective, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm focused on contributing to the battalion's mission and proving my value through consistent performance." "That's the right approach," Rodriguez said, though his expression suggested that he understood the challenges she was facing. Colonel Hartwell is an experienced officer who has strong opinions about how intelligence should be integrated into military operations. Sometimes it takes time to build the kind of professional relationship that allows for effective collaboration. Sarah understood that Rodriguez was providing her with the most support he could offer while maintaining his position in the battalion's hierarchy. The major's guidance was valuable, but it also highlighted the limitations of relying on others to address the systematic marginalization she was experiencing. As she returned to her quarters that evening, Sarah reflected on the day's events and their implications for her future in the battalion. The exercise had provided undeniable validation of her analytical capabilities and professional competence, but it had also escalated the tension between her and Colonel Hartwell in ways that would make their relationship even more difficult to manage. The vindication she had received from the Pacific Command evaluators was significant, but Sarah understood that it would likely increase rather than decrease the hostility she faced from her commanding officer. Colonel Hartwell's authority had been questioned in public, and his judgment had been implicitly criticized by visiting evaluators who had praised her performance. The quiet determination that had sustained Sarah throughout her career would be tested in the weeks ahead as she navigated the complex aftermath of her success and the likely consequences of having proven herself right when her commanding officer had been wrong. The first test had been passed, but Sarah understood that it had also raised the stakes for all future challenges she would face under Colonel Hartwell's command. The aftermath of Operation Northern Shield marked a turning point in Colonel Hartwell's approach to Sarah's presence in the battalion. Where his previous hostility had been clothed in the language of professional development and unit standards, his response to her vindication during the exercise took on a more systematic and deliberate character. The public recognition of her analytical capabilities had not led to improved relations, but rather to an escalation of the obstacles placed in her path. The Monday morning following the exercise debriefing brought Sarah's first indication of the Colonel's adjusted strategy. She arrived at the operations center to find that her workstation had been relocated to a corner position with limited visibility to the main command displays. The move was explained as necessary for improved workflow efficiency, but the result was to isolate her from the central intelligence activities that were essential to her job performance. Captain Williams approached her new position with obvious concern about the change. "This doesn't make sense from an operational standpoint," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention. "Intelligence officers need to be integrated with the operations staff, not segregated from them." Sarah began setting up her equipment in the new location, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obvious intent behind the relocation. "I'll adapt to whatever configuration works best for the battalion's operations," she replied, though she understood that the move was designed to limit her access to real-time intelligence and reduce her ability to contribute to tactical discussions. The isolation of her workstation was accompanied by changes to her duty assignments that further marginalized her role in the battalion's intelligence operations. While Captain Williams and the other intelligence officers were tasked with analyzing incoming reports and preparing briefings for senior leadership, Sarah found herself assigned to administrative duties that utilized none of her analytical capabilities. Her daily responsibilities included maintaining filing systems, updating personnel records, and conducting inventory checks that could have been performed by junior enlisted personnel. Major Rodriguez appeared at her workstation around mid-morning, carrying a stack of personnel files and wearing an expression that suggested discomfort with the task he was about to assign. "Lieutenant Chen, I need you to review these efficiency reports and prepare summary statistics for the monthly readiness briefing," he said, his tone apologetic despite the routine nature of the request. Sarah accepted the assignment without comment, though she recognized that her graduate-level analytical training was being used to perform clerical work that had no connection to the battalion's intelligence mission. The message was clear. Regardless of her demonstrated competence during the exercise, she would not be permitted to contribute meaningfully to the unit's operational activities. The efficiency reports revealed patterns of performance evaluation that reflected the battalion's institutional culture. Officers who had graduated from service academies received consistently higher ratings than those with civilian educational backgrounds, even when their actual performance was comparable. Male officers were more likely to receive leadership opportunities and advanced training assignments, while female officers were typically assigned to administrative roles that limited their career advancement potential. Sarah's review of the data also revealed that her own performance evaluations from previous assignments had been consistently excellent, with commendations for analytical skill, professional competence, and leadership potential. The contrast between her documented abilities and her current assignment to clerical duties highlighted the arbitrary nature of Colonel Hartwell's approach to her integration into the battalion. The monthly readiness briefing took place in the main conference room, with Colonel Hartwell presiding over a comprehensive review of the battalion's personnel, equipment, and training status. Sarah had prepared detailed statistical analyses of the efficiency reports, identifying trends and patterns that could inform decisions about training priorities and personnel development. However, when she attempted to present her findings, the colonel's response was dismissive. "Thank you, Lieutenant, but we're only interested in the basic statistics," he said, cutting off her presentation before she could discuss the analytical insights she had developed. "Please provide the numerical data and move on to the next item." The interruption was delivered with the same public criticism that had characterized his approach to her performance since her arrival. Sarah provided the requested statistics without elaboration, though she knew that her analysis could have informed important decisions about the battalion's personnel management and training effectiveness. Captain Williams, who was observing the briefing from the back of the room, approached her afterward with obvious frustration about the missed opportunity. "Your analysis of the efficiency reports was exactly what we needed to identify training gaps and personnel issues," he said, his voice carrying disappointment about the colonel's response. "That kind of analytical insight is what intelligence officers are supposed to provide." Sarah appreciated his support, though she understood that Williams' recognition of her capabilities did not translate into practical influence over Colonel Hartwell's decisions. The captain was a skilled officer who understood the value of her analytical work, but he lacked the authority to ensure that her contributions were properly utilized. The pattern of administrative assignments continued throughout the week, with Sarah finding herself increasingly isolated from the intelligence operations that were central to her professional identity. While her colleagues analyzed emerging threats and prepared tactical assessments, she was assigned to update training schedules, review supply requisitions, and maintain databases that required no analytical skill to manage effectively. The isolation was not limited to her professional duties, but extended to the social dynamics that were essential to unit cohesion. Sarah found herself excluded from the informal discussions that took place around the coffee station, where officers shared intelligence insights and discussed tactical problems. When she attempted to contribute to these conversations, her comments were met with polite but distant responses that suggested she was not considered a full member of the intelligence team. The exclusion became more apparent during Guarin, the weekly intelligence meeting, where officers typically shared information and coordinated their analytical efforts. Sarah was assigned to take notes and maintain meeting records, while her colleagues engaged in substantive discussions about intelligence priorities and analytical methodologies. Her attempts to contribute to these discussions were consistently redirected or dismissed, reinforcing her status as an observer rather than a participant. Major Rodriguez attempted to address the situation during a private conversation in his office, though his approach was diplomatic rather than confrontational. "I want to ensure that you're finding meaningful ways to contribute to the battalion's mission," he said, his tone suggesting genuine concern about her professional development. "I appreciate your interest in my assignment, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the professional demeanor that had become her default response to discussions about her role in the battalion. "I'm committed to performing whatever duties are assigned to me to the best of my abilities." Rodriguez's expression suggested that he understood the diplomatic nature of her response and the constraints that prevented her from speaking more directly about her situation. "Your analytical skills are valuable assets that should be fully utilized," he said carefully. "Sometimes it takes time to identify the most effective ways to integrate those skills into our operational framework." The conversation provided Sarah with the understanding that Rodriguez recognized the waste of her capabilities, but was limited in his ability to address the situation directly. The major's support was genuine but constrained by the hierarchical dynamics that governed military organizations and his own position within Colonel Hartwell's command structure. The following week brought a new challenge when Sarah was assigned to conduct a comprehensive review of the battalion's administrative procedures, a task that would require her to examine every aspect of the unit's bureaucratic operations. The assignment was presented as an important contribution to operational efficiency, but Sarah understood that it was designed to consume her time with make-work that would prevent her from engaging with intelligence activities. The administrative review revealed systematic inefficiencies and procedural inconsistencies that suggested opportunities for significant improvement. Sarah prepared a detailed report with specific recommendations for streamlining processes and reducing administrative burden on operational personnel. However, when she submitted her findings to Colonel Hartwell, his response was characteristically dismissive. "Administrative efficiency is important, Lieutenant, but our primary focus must remain on operational readiness," he said, setting aside her report without reviewing its contents. "I suggest you concentrate on learning our existing procedures before attempting to recommend changes." The dismissal of her administrative analysis followed the same pattern as his response to her intelligence work during the exercise. Regardless of the quality of her analysis or the relevance of her recommendations, Colonel Hartwell consistently characterized her contributions as inappropriate or premature. The message was clear. Her role in the battalion was to follow orders and maintain existing procedures, not to provide analytical insights or suggest improvements. Sarah's isolation became more pronounced during the battalion's preparation for their upcoming deployment to Korea. While her colleagues were assigned to analyze the regional threat environment and prepare intelligence assessments that would support operational planning, she was tasked with organizing travel arrangements and coordinating administrative logistics. The assignment was important, but required none of the specialized training that had qualified her for the intelligence officer position. The deployment preparations also revealed the extent to which Colonel Hartwell's approach to Sarah was affecting the battalion's operational effectiveness. Her expertise in regional analysis and language skills would have been valuable assets for the Korean deployment, but these capabilities were being systematically underutilized in favor of administrative tasks that could have been performed by personnel with less specialized training. Captain Williams made several attempts to advocate for Sarah's inclusion in the deployment planning process, arguing that her analytical skills and cultural knowledge would enhance the battalion's intelligence capabilities. However, His recommendations were consistently rejected by Colonel Hartwell, who maintained that the existing intelligence team was sufficient for the mission requirements. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She brings would complement our tactical intelligence capabilities. Colonel Hartwell's response was swift and definitive. Captain, we have experienced intelligence officers who understand the operational environment and can provide the analysis we need. Lieutenant Chun's role will be to support these officers through administrative assistance and routine tasks. The exchange highlighted the fundamental contradiction in Colonel Hartwell's approach to Sarah's integration into the battalion. He consistently characterized her academic achievements as irrelevant to military operations while simultaneously preventing her from gaining the practical experience that he claimed was essential for effective performance. The result was a self-fulfilling prophecy that justified his initial assessment of her capabilities while preventing her from demonstrating her actual potential. That the systematic nature of the obstacles placed in Sarah's path became more apparent as the deployment preparations intensified. She was excluded from classified briefings that were essential to understanding the intelligence requirements for the Korean mission, while being assigned to maintain security protocols that required her to process classified information without understanding its operational context. The contradiction created practical problems that affected the battalion's administrative efficiency. Sarah was responsible for organizing classified materials and coordinating security procedures, but her exclusion from operational briefings meant that she lacked the context necessary to prioritize tasks or identify potential security issues. The result was a bureaucratic maze that consumed time and resources while providing little actual benefit to the unit's operational readiness. Major Rodriguez attempted to address these inefficiencies during a staff meeting, though his approach was indirect and diplomatic. We might benefit from better integration between our administrative and operational functions, he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. Some of our procedures seem to create unnecessary complications. Colonel Hartwell's response suggested that he understood the subtext of Rodriguez's comment, but was not prepared to modify his approach. Our procedures have been developed through years of successful operations, he replied, his voice carrying a note of finality. Changes should be made carefully and only when absolutely necessary. The exchange confirmed Sarah's understanding that the inefficiencies created by her marginalization were less important to Colonel Hartwell than maintaining the hierarchical dynamics that supported his authority. The colonel was willing to accept reduced operational effectiveness in order to preserve his approach to her integration into the battalion. The final week before deployment brought Sarah's assignment to the most isolated duty possible within the battalion's structure. She was tasked with maintaining the unit's historical records and preparing archival materials for storage during the deployment. The assignment required her to work alone in a basement storage facility, physically separated from the operational activities that were consuming the attention of her colleagues. The historical records revealed the battalion's distinguished service in previous conflicts, including detailed accounts of intelligence operations that had contributed to strategic successes. Sarah found herself reading about the achievements of previous intelligence officers who had demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical capabilities that were being systematically suppressed in her own case. The contrast between the battalion's historical appreciation for intelligence analysis and Colonel Hartwell's current approach to her role was stark and demoralizing. The isolation of the archives assignment was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Colonel Morrison, the Pacific Command evaluator who had praised her performance during Operation Northern Shield. His appearance in the basement storage facility was clearly not routine, and his expression suggested concern about finding her assigned to archival duties. "Lieutenant Chun," he said, his tone carrying surprise and disapproval, I'm somewhat puzzled to find you working in the archives. Given your performance during the recent exercise, I would have expected you to be fully integrated into the deployment planning process." Sarah maintained her professional composure despite the obvious implications of the colonel's observation. "I'm performing the duties assigned to me by my commanding officer, sir," she replied, though she understood that Morrison's comment represented a significant recognition of the inappropriate nature of her current assignment. Morrison's expression suggested that he understood the political dynamics that had led to her assignment to the archives, but was limited in his ability to address the situation directly. "Your analytical capabilities are valuable assets that should be fully utilized," he said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who was not constrained by the battalion's internal hierarchy. "I hope you'll have opportunities to apply those skills more directly in the future." The visit from Colonel Morrison provided Sarah with the understanding that her situation was being observed by senior officers outside the battalion's command structure. The recognition was encouraging, but also highlighted the limitations of her current position and the systematic nature of the obstacles she was facing. As the deployment date approached, Sarah found herself preparing for a mission where her most valuable capabilities would remain unused, while she performed administrative tasks that utilized none of her specialized training. The pattern of escalating opposition had reached its logical conclusion, with Colonel Hartwell successfully isolating her from any meaningful contribution to the battalion's operational effectiveness. The quiet determination that had sustained Sarah throughout her career would be tested in the weeks ahead as she prepared for deployment where her professional isolation would be complete and her opportunities for vindication would be limited. Colonel Hartwell had systematically escalated his opposition to her presence, but Sarah understood that the deployment would provide new challenges and perhaps new opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities despite the constraints that had been placed upon her. The deployment to Camp Casey in South Korea began under leaden skies that matched the oppressive atmosphere Sarah had endured for the past 2 months. The 47th Intelligence Battalion's advance party had arrived 3 days earlier to establish operations in the theater, while Sarah found herself assigned to the rear echelon responsible for administrative support and logistics coordination. The assignment effectively removed her from any meaningful intelligence activities during the most critical phase of the deployment. Colonel Hartwell had structured the deployment assignments with surgical precision, ensuring that Sarah's exclusion from operational duties would be complete and unassailable. While Captain Williams and the other intelligence officers were integrated into the forward command structure, Sarah was assigned to coordinate supply requisitions and maintain personnel records from a converted storage facility that served as the battalion's administrative center. The physical separation from the main operations center was both symbolic and practical, isolating her from the intelligence activities that defined her professional identity. The converted storage facility buzzed with the controlled chaos of military logistics, but the activity was fundamentally different from the intellectual challenges that had drawn Sarah to intelligence work. Enlisted personnel moved through the space processing equipment requisitions and coordinating transportation schedules, while Sarah found herself managing paperwork that required no analytical skill or strategic thinking. The contrast between her capabilities and her assignments had reached an almost absurd level of mismatch. Staff Sergeant Martinez, who supervised the administrative operations, approached Sarah's workstation with a stack of supply forms that needed processing. His expression suggested sympathy for her situation, though military protocol prevented him from commenting directly on the inappropriate nature of her assignment to clerical duties. "Lieutenant, these requisitions need to be reviewed and forwarded to the supply officer," he said, his tone professional but carrying an undertone of apology. "Most of them are routine requests, but a few require officer-level approval." Sarah accepted the forms with the same professional demeanor that had characterized her response to every Assignment since her arrival at Fort Richardson, the supply. Requisitions were indeed routine, requiring no special expertise to process, but she completed the task with the same attention to detail that she had applied to complex intelligence analysis. The commitment to excellence, regardless of the nature of the work, was a personal standard that she refused to compromise. The isolation of her assignment became more apparent as the deployment progressed, and the battalion's intelligence operations expanded to meet the demands of the Korean theater. Sarah could hear fragments of conversations about emerging threats and analytical challenges, but she was systematically excluded from participating in the work that utilized her training and experience. The physical proximity to meaningful intelligence activities made her professional exile even more frustrating. Major Rodriguez appeared at the administrative center during the second week of the deployment, ostensibly to review logistics procedures, but clearly also to check on Sarah's situation. His expression suggested concern about the continued waste of her capabilities, though he was limited in his ability to address the situation directly within the constraints of military hierarchy. "How are you adapting to the deployment environment, Lieutenant?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine interest in her welfare, despite the obvious limitations of her current assignment. "I'm focused on supporting the battalion's mission in whatever capacity I'm assigned, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the diplomatic language that had become her default response to discussions about her role. "The administrative support functions are important to our overall operational effectiveness." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested that he understood the professional frustration underlying her measured response. "Your analytical skills are valuable assets that I hope we'll be able to utilize more fully as the deployment progresses," he said carefully, providing encouragement while avoiding direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell's assignment decisions. The conversation provided Sarah with the understanding that Rodriguez continued to recognize her capabilities, but remained constrained by the hierarchical dynamics that governed military organizations. The Major's support was genuine but limited in its practical impact on her situation, highlighting the systemic nature of the obstacles she was facing. The third week of the deployment brought a significant intelligence challenge that would test the battalion's analytical capabilities and provide Sarah with an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate her value. North Korean forces had begun conducting unusual electronic warfare exercises along the demilitarized zone, creating signal patterns that were disrupting communications and surveillance systems throughout the region. The activity suggested either a major training exercise or preparation for offensive operations, but the intelligence picture was complex and contradictory. Captain Williams approached the administrative center during the crisis, his expression reflecting the stress of dealing with an intelligence problem that was exceeding the battalion's analytical capabilities. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time since the deployment began, "I need your help with something, but it has to be unofficial." Sarah understood immediately that Williams was asking her to provide analytical support outside the formal command structure that had isolated her from intelligence activities. The request was potentially dangerous for both of them, but it also represented the first opportunity she had been given to apply her skills to a meaningful operational problem. "What kind of help?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral despite her growing interest in the challenge. Williams glanced around the administrative center to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer to explain the situation. "The electronic warfare patterns we're seeing don't match any known North Korean doctrine or training protocols. Our standard analytical frameworks aren't providing useful insights, and the Colonel is demanding answers that we can't provide with conventional approaches." Sarah's analytical instincts were immediately engaged by the challenge Williams was describing. Electronic warfare patterns were exactly the kind of complex intelligence problem that required the sophisticated analytical techniques she had developed through her academic training and previous assignments. The opportunity to apply her skills to a real operational challenge was irresistible, despite the risks involved. "I'd be happy to take a look at the data," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had characterized her approach to analytical challenges throughout her career. "Do you have access to the raw intelligence feeds?" Williams nodded, producing a portable drive that contained the classified intelligence data that formed the basis of the battalion's analytical efforts. "This has to remain completely unofficial," he emphasized, his tone reflecting the seriousness of the security and protocol violations involved in sharing classified information outside the formal command structure. Sarah accepted the drive with the understanding that she was entering potentially dangerous territory. Analyzing classified intelligence without official authorization could result in serious disciplinary action, but the opportunity to contribute to the battalion's mission was worth the risk. She also understood that Williams was taking an even greater risk by providing her with access to the classified data. The electronic warfare patterns revealed themselves to be far more sophisticated than the battalion's initial assessments had suggested. Sarah's analysis identified subtle variations in signal timing and frequency modulation that indicated the use of advanced electronic countermeasures technology that was not believed to be in the North Korean inventory. The pattern suggested either a significant upgrade in their electronic warfare capabilities or the involvement of a third party with access to more advanced systems. Her analysis also revealed that the electronic warfare exercises were coordinated with unusual movement patterns of North Korean ground forces, suggesting that the activities were part of a larger operational plan rather than routine training. The coordination between electronic warfare and ground force movements indicated preparation for offensive operations that could threaten South Korean and American forces throughout the region. Sarah prepared a comprehensive analytical assessment that incorporated her findings and provided recommendations for counterintelligence and defensive measures. The analysis was the most sophisticated intelligence work she had produced since arriving at Fort Richardson, utilizing analytical techniques that went far beyond the standard approaches used by the battalion's intelligence staff. Captain Williams reviewed her analysis with obvious amazement at the insights she had developed from the same data that had frustrated the battalion's other analysts. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, his voice carrying admiration for her analytical capabilities. "Your assessment explains patterns that we couldn't understand with conventional approaches." The challenge was determining how to present Sarah's analysis to Colonel Hartwell without revealing the unauthorized nature of her involvement in the intelligence work. Williams understood that the colonel's hostility towards Sarah would likely result in the dismissal of her analysis regardless of its quality, but the operational significance of her findings made it essential that the information reach the command level. "I think I need to present this analysis as my own work," Williams said reluctantly, his expression reflecting discomfort with the deception, but understanding of the practical necessities involved. "The colonel won't accept analytical insights from you, but he might listen if he thinks they came from me." Sarah understood the logic behind Williams' suggestion, though the prospect of having her work attributed to someone else was professionally painful. The analysis represented some of her best work, utilizing skills and techniques that had been developed through years of specialized training, but she recognized that ensuring its operational impact was more important than receiving personal credit. "The mission is more important than individual recognition," she said, her voice reflecting the professional commitment that had guided her throughout her career. "If presenting the analysis as your work will ensure that it receives proper consideration, then that's what we should do." Williams nodded, though his expression suggested that he understood the professional sacrifice Sarah was making. "I'll make sure that the right people know about your actual contribution," he said, his tone carrying a promise that he would eventually ensure that her analytical work received appropriate recognition. The briefing that followed proved to be a turning point in the deployment's intelligence operations. Williams presented Sarah's analysis with the same professional competence that had characterized his own work, while Colonel Hartwell listened with the attention that he had consistently denied to Sarah's previous contributions. The Colonel's response was enthusiastic, praising the analytical insights and directing immediate implementation of the recommended counterintelligence measures. "This is exactly the kind of sophisticated analysis we need from our intelligence staff," Colonel Hartwell announced, his voice carrying approval that Sarah had never heard directed toward her own work. "Captain Williams, your assessment of the electronic warfare patterns demonstrates the analytical capabilities that are essential for successful intelligence operations." Sarah watched the briefing from the back of the room, having been permitted to attend only because her administrative duties included maintaining meeting records. The irony of seeing her own analysis praised while she remained invisible to the colonel was almost overwhelming, but she maintained her professional composure, despite the emotional impact of the situation. The implementation of her recommendations proved immediately successful, with counterintelligence measures effectively neutralizing the North Korean electronic warfare activities and providing valuable intelligence about their advanced capabilities. The success of the operation was attributed to Captain Williams' analytical insights, while Sarah's actual contribution remained hidden from official recognition. The success of the electronic warfare analysis led to increased demands for sophisticated intelligence assessments that exceeded the battalion's conventional analytical capabilities. Williams found himself overwhelmed by requests for the kind of complex analysis that Sarah had provided, but he lacked the specialized training and analytical techniques that had enabled her breakthrough insights. "I need your help again," Williams said during a private conversation in the administrative center. "The colonel is demanding follow-up analysis on the electronic warfare patterns, and I can't replicate the analytical approach you used." Sarah understood that Williams was essentially asking her to continue providing unauthorized analytical support while he received credit for her work. The arrangement was professionally demeaning but represented her only opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the battalion's intelligence mission. The choice was between accepting the invisible role or remaining completely excluded from operational activities. "I'll continue to provide whatever analytical support you need," she replied, her voice reflecting resignation to the situation while maintaining her commitment to the mission. "The operational impact is what matters, not individual recognition." The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was both productive and professionally destructive for Sarah. She continued to provide sophisticated, analytical insights that were essential to the battalion's intelligence operations, while Williams presented her work as his own and received the recognition that should have been hers. The arrangement allowed her to contribute to the mission while maintaining the fiction that she was not involved in intelligence activities. Colonel Hartwell's praise for Williams' analytical work became increasingly effusive as the deployment progressed and the unauthorized collaboration continued to produce valuable intelligence insights. The colonel began recommending Williams for advanced training and promotion opportunities, while Sarah remained invisible in her administrative role despite being the actual source of the analytical breakthroughs. The situation reached its breaking point during a critical intelligence briefing when Colonel Hartwell publicly criticized the battalion's administrative efficiency, while simultaneously praising Williams' analytical contributions. The contrast between his treatment of Sarah's actual work and his assessment of her official duties created a moment of cognitive dissonance that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. "Lieutenant Chen," Colonel Hartwell announced during the briefing, his voice carrying the dismissive tone that had characterized his interactions with her throughout the deployment. "Your administrative support has been adequate, but I expect better attention to detail in maintaining our logistics records." The criticism was delivered in the same room where Sarah's analytical work was being praised when attributed to Williams, creating a surreal situation that tested her professional composure. The colonel was simultaneously dismissing her contributions while benefiting from her capabilities, apparently without recognizing the contradiction in his approach. Major Rodriguez approached Sarah after the briefing, his expression reflecting concern about the colonel's increasingly harsh treatment of her performance. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that your administrative work has been exemplary," he said, his tone suggesting that he understood the unfairness of the colonel's criticism. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the emotional impact of the situation. "I'm committed to meeting whatever standards are expected of me." Rodriguez's expression suggested that he understood the subtext of her response and the professional frustration that she was experiencing. "Sometimes the most important contributions go unrecognized," he said carefully, providing encouragement while avoiding direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell's approach. The conversation provided Sarah with the understanding that Rodriguez and other officers were aware of the systematic unfairness of her treatment, but that they were limited in their ability to address the situation directly. The recognition was encouraging, but also highlighted the institutional constraints that prevented her from receiving appropriate recognition for her contributions. The final crisis of the deployment came when North Korean forces began conducting coordinated exercises that suggested preparation for major offensive operations. The intelligence challenge was complex and urgent, requiring the kind of sophisticated analysis that had become Sarah's specialty during the deployment. However, the crisis also coincided with Colonel Hartwell's decision to recommend Williams for immediate promotion and assignment to a prestigious intelligence position at Pacific Command. The timing of the promotion recommendation created a situation where Sarah's analytical support would be essential to managing the crisis, but Williams would receive the career advancement that her work had made possible. The injustice of the situation was apparent to everyone who understood the actual dynamics of the intelligence operations, but the military hierarchy prevented any direct challenge to Colonel Hartwell's decisions. Sarah found herself facing the most difficult decision of her military career: whether to continue providing the analytical support that was essential to the battalion's mission while watching someone else receive credit for her work and advancement opportunities that should have been hers. The choice would define not only her immediate future, but also her long-term commitment to a military career that had systematically undervalued her contributions. The breaking point had arrived, and Sarah Chen understood that her response to this crisis would determine whether she would continue to accept the systematic marginalization that had characterized her military experience or find a way to assert her professional worth despite the institutional obstacles that had been placed in her path. The North Korean crisis intensified over the following week, but Sarah's response to the mounting pressure was different from anything she had demonstrated during her previous months under Colonel Hartwell's command. Instead of continuing to provide anonymous analytical support through Captain Williams, she began a methodical process of documenting her contributions and preparing for a confrontation that would either vindicate her professional worth or end her military career. Sarah's first step was to create a comprehensive record of her analytical work during the deployment, including timestamps, data sources, and methodological approaches that clearly demonstrated her role in developing the intelligence insights that had been attributed to Williams. She worked during her off-duty hours, using her personal laptop to compile evidence that would be undeniable if the situation required formal documentation of her contributions. The documentation process revealed the extent to which her analytical capabilities had been systematically underutilized throughout the deployment. Every major intelligence breakthrough during the Korean mission could be traced to her work, from the initial assessment of North Korean electronic warfare patterns to the ongoing analysis of coordinated military exercises. The pattern was clear. Sarah had been the primary source of sophisticated intelligence analysis while receiving no recognition for her contributions. Her preparation extended beyond documentation to include research into military regulations and procedures that governed intelligence operations and personnel assignments. Sarah discovered that Colonel Hartwell's systematic exclusion of her from operational duties violated several provisions of military policy regarding the utilization of qualified personnel. The regulations were clear about the requirement to assign officers to duties that matched their qualifications and training, but enforcement of these provisions required formal complaints that could damage careers. The most significant aspect of Sarah's preparation was her decision to establish direct communication with Colonel Morrison, the Pacific Command evaluator who had praised her performance during Operation Northern Shield. The contact was initiated through official channels, with Sarah requesting a meeting to discuss career development opportunities in the intelligence field. The request was professionally appropriate but strategically significant, creating a potential channel for addressing her situation outside the battalion's command structure. Colonel Morrison's response to her request was prompt and encouraging, suggesting that her reputation had preceded her in the Pacific Command intelligence community. He agreed to meet with her during his next visit to Camp Casey, providing Sarah with an opportunity to present her case to someone who had already recognized her capabilities and who possessed the authority to address systematic mismanagement of personnel resources. Sarah's preparation also included cultivating relationships with other intelligence officers in the theater who had observed her work during previous assignments. These informal networks provided her with valuable insights into career opportunities and potential allies who could support her professional development. The relationships also created alternative channels for her analytical work to reach appropriate levels of command recognition. The documentation of her contributions became particularly important as the North Korean crisis evolved into a complex intelligence challenge that required exactly the kind of sophisticated analysis that Sarah had been providing. The coordinated military exercises suggested preparation for offensive operations, but the intelligence indicators were subtle and required analytical techniques that exceeded the capabilities of the battalion's conventional intelligence staff. Captain Williams approached Sarah with increasing frequency as the crisis deepened, his requests for analytical support becoming more desperate as he struggled to meet Colonel Hartwell's demands for comprehensive intelligence assessments. The captain's dependence on Sarah's analytical capabilities was becoming apparent to other officers in the battalion, creating a situation that would eventually require acknowledgement of her actual role in the intelligence operations. The colonel is demanding a complete assessment of North Korean offensive capabilities within 24 hours, Williams said during one of their clandestine meetings in the administrative center. I can't produce that kind of analysis without your help, and I'm running out of ways to explain my suddenly enhanced analytical capabilities. Sarah understood that Williams was facing a crisis that would expose the collaborative relationship that had sustained the battalion's intelligence operations for weeks. The captain's inability to replicate her analytical methods was becoming obvious, and his requests for her assistance were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal from other officers in the unit. I think it's time for a different approach, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a determination that Williams had not heard from her previously. The current arrangement isn't sustainable, and it's not serving the mission or our professional integrity. Williams' expression suggested that he understood the implications of Sarah's statement. The collaborative relationship that had allowed him to present her work as his own was becoming untenable, and the approaching crisis would require a more transparent approach to the battalion's intelligence operations. Sarah's preparation for the inevitable confrontation included developing alternative analytical frameworks that could be implemented without her direct involvement. She created detailed procedural guides that explained her analytical methods and provided templates that other intelligence officers could use to replicate her approaches. The documentation would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate her professional competence, provide operational continuity if she were removed from the battalion, and create a record of her intellectual contributions that could not be easily dismissed. The procedural guides also served as a form of professional insurance, ensuring that her analytical methods would continue to benefit the battalion's operations, regardless of her personal fate. Sarah understood that her primary responsibility was to the mission and the soldiers who depended on accurate intelligence, even if her own career prospects were uncertain. Major Rodriguez became an inadvertent ally in Sarah's preparation when he requested a comprehensive review of the battalion's intelligence procedures as part of the deployment's after-action assessment. The review provided Sarah with an official justification for documenting her analytical methods and highlighting the gaps between the battalion's official intelligence capabilities and its actual performance during the deployment. Your analysis of our intelligence procedures is thorough and insightful, Rodriguez said after reviewing her preliminary findings. You've identified several areas where our standard approaches could be enhanced through more sophisticated analytical techniques. Sarah used the review process to subtly document her contributions to the battalion's intelligence operations without directly challenging Colonel Hartwell's assignment decisions. The approach was diplomatically safe, but strategically significant, creating an official record of her analytical capabilities that could be referenced in future discussions about her professional development. The preparation phase of Sarah's response to the crisis also included strategic planning for her eventual meeting with Colonel Morrison. She developed a comprehensive presentation that documented her analytical contributions, highlighted the systematic underutilization of her capabilities, and proposed solutions that would benefit both her career development and the military's intelligence operations. The presentation was carefully crafted to avoid direct criticism of Colonel Hartwell while clearly demonstrating the waste of resources that his approach had created. Sarah focused on the positive aspects of her contributions and the potential for enhanced intelligence capabilities if her skills were properly utilized. The approach was professional and constructive, emphasizing solutions rather than complaints. Her strategic planning also included contingency preparations for various possible outcomes of the confrontation with Colonel Morrison. Sarah developed multiple scenarios ranging from immediate reassignment to formal complaints processes, ensuring that she would be prepared for any response to her documentation of the battalion's personnel management issues. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's preparation was maintaining her professional performance while dealing with the emotional stress of planning a confrontation that could determine her military career. She continued to provide analytical support through Williams, while simultaneously preparing to expose the arrangement that had sustained the battalion's intelligence operations. The internal tension created by this dual approach was significant, but Sarah's commitment to both the mission and her professional integrity prevented her from abandoning either responsibility. She understood that her analytical contributions were essential to the battalion's operational effectiveness, even as she prepared to challenge the system that had marginalized her contributions. The final element of Sarah's preparation was the development of a comprehensive proposal for restructuring the battalion's intelligence operations to better utilize available analytical capabilities. The proposal was professionally focused and operationally sound, demonstrating her understanding of both the technical requirements of intelligence analysis and the organizational dynamics that govern military units. The proposal also served as a test of the military's commitment to merit-based personnel management. If her recommendations were accepted, it would demonstrate that the institution valued competence over hierarchy. If they were rejected, it would provide clear evidence of the systematic barriers that prevented qualified personnel from contributing effectively to military operations. Sarah's quiet preparation represented a fundamental shift in her approach to the challenges she had faced since arriving at Fort Richardson. Instead of passively accepting the systematic marginalization that had characterized her experience, She was preparing to assert her professional worth through documentation, evidence, and strategic planning. The preparation phase was methodical and thorough, reflecting the analytical capabilities that had been systematically underutilized throughout her assignment to the battalion. The approaching confrontation with Colonel Morrison would test not only Sarah's documentation and strategic planning, but also the military's institutional commitment to utilizing qualified personnel effectively. The outcome would determine whether merit and competence could overcome institutional prejudice and systemic barriers to professional advancement. 3 years later, Brigadier General Sarah Chen stood in the same conference room at Fort Richardson where Colonel Hartwell had once dismissed her analysis as academic theorizing. The irony was not lost on her as she reviewed the personnel files of her new command, files that included Colonel Marcus Hartwell, now serving as her deputy commander. The promotion ceremony had been swift and decisive. Sarah's documentation of analytical breakthroughs during the Korean deployment had reached the highest levels of Pacific Command, leading to her rapid advancement through the ranks. Her innovative intelligence methods had been adopted across multiple commands, saving countless lives and resources. Colonel Hartwell entered the briefing room with the same confident stride he had always possessed, but his expression shifted when he saw the stars on Sarah's shoulders. The recognition was immediate and unmistakable. The quiet lieutenant he had systematically marginalized was now his commanding officer. "Colonel Hartwell," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of rank but none of the vindictiveness he might have expected. "I look forward to working with you again. Your experience will be valuable as we implement new intelligence protocols across the division." The grace in her response spoke volumes about the leader she had become. Where others might have sought revenge, Sarah chose transformation. Under her command, the division became a model for merit-based leadership and inclusive excellence. Captain Williams, now Major Williams, later wrote in his memoir, "General Chun taught us that true strength isn't about proving you're better than others. It's about making others better than they thought possible." What's your most inspiring underdog story? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes who prove that quiet determination can change the world. New inspiring stories every week, because everyone deserves to know that their potential is limitless.